Rule 5 from Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life states, "Do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them," which sounds jarringly harsh until you realize the world is far less forgiving than a parent. The premise flips modern parenting on its head. Instead of unconditional acceptance of every behavior, it demands that parents act as the primary socializing agents for their children, standing in for society at large. Theodore, this rule always strikes a nerve because it forces parents to confront their own capacity for resentment.
It definitely strikes a nerve, Miles, and that is precisely Peterson's intention. When Peterson published this in 2018, he was speaking directly against a prevailing cultural current that treats children as inherently perfect and views any imposition of authority as oppressive. He often refers to the concept of the ignoble savage in this chapter, pushing back against the romanticized notion that human beings are born naturally good and are only corrupted by society. From a clinical psychology perspective, children are complex creatures that require intense socialization to become acceptable members of a community. If a parent, who supposedly loves their child more than anyone else, finds a specific behavior annoying or repulsive, how do they think a stranger, a teacher, or a future employer is going to react?
That shifts the burden from merely protecting a child to actually preparing them for reality. We often see parents paralyzed by the fear that their kids will stop loving them if they set strict boundaries. They choose to be friends rather than authority figures. But how did we get here historically? It feels like this fear of disciplining children is a relatively modern phenomenon.
It is, and we can trace a lot of that back to the mid-20th century. Following the cultural shifts of the 1960s, there was a massive rejection of traditional authority figures, and that adolescent ethos heavily influenced child-rearing. We saw the rise of what Peterson and others have called a fear of adultism, the idea that it is somehow prejudiced or authoritarian for adults to impose their will on children. Parents started viewing their kids simultaneously as fragile beings who could be permanently traumatized by the word no, and as perfect angels whose impulses should not be stifled. Peterson critiques this by arguing that depriving a child of correction actually deprives them of the ability to engage in independent, socially acceptable action.
He uses a very specific, almost uncomfortable anecdote to illustrate that, right? The story about a couple essentially tailing their 2-year-old constantly during a social visit.
Exactly. He describes watching a couple who were completely unwilling to say no to their toddler. Because they refused to correct him, they had to micromanage his every move to prevent disaster. By avoiding the momentary conflict of discipline, they perversely robbed the child of any genuine freedom. He could not be trusted for a single second. Peterson uses this to highlight a core psychological truth. Setting boundaries is not about restricting freedom. It is about creating a safe, predictable framework within which a child can safely explore and eventually thrive socially.
And there's a tight biological and social window for this to happen. According to Peterson's clinical observations, if a child is not taught how to behave properly by the age of 4, it becomes extraordinarily difficult for them to ever make friends. That is a terrifying timeline for a new parent.
It is a crucial developmental milestone. By age 4, children are expected to transition from parallel play to cooperative play. If a child has not learned to share, to pay attention when spoken to, or to regulate their aggression, their peers will simply reject them. And the academic literature broadly supports this. Children who are rejected by their peers early on often struggle to develop their full potential, which can cascade into antisocial behavior in adolescence and depression in adulthood. Peterson argues that if parents truly want the best for their children, they have to stomach the short-term pain of their child's temporary anger to secure their long-term social survival.
That brings up an interesting tension. Discipline is presented as an act of love, a careful combination of mercy and long-term judgment. But some critics of Peterson's approach argue that he leans too heavily on a dark, almost antagonistic view of childhood. How do his detractors view this specific rule?
That is a very valid critique. Some commentators point out that Peterson focuses intensely on the negative aspects of behavior modification. He talks a lot about using threats or punishment to eliminate bad behaviors, but spends surprisingly little time on positive reinforcement, which modern child psychology considers absolutely central to effective parenting. Furthermore, critics note that he wraps practical, common-sense parenting advice in heavy existential and mythological jargon. He frequently invokes figures like Freud, Jung, and Nietzsche, or concepts like being with a capital B, which can make a straightforward lesson about teaching your kid to share sound like a cosmic battle between order and chaos.
It does feel like he elevates a tantrum in a grocery store to a metaphysical crisis. But perhaps that framing is exactly why the book resonated with so many people. By casting the parent as the thin line between social order and nihilistic chaos, he gives a deep sense of meaning to the exhausting, mundane work of raising children.
That is the core of his appeal. Peterson is addressing a generation of parents who feel adrift, lacking a sturdy moral framework. When he says that life is suffering and that we must adopt as much responsibility as possible to reduce that suffering, he is offering an antidote to modern nihilism. By enforcing Rule 5, a parent is not just stopping a child from throwing food, they are actively participating in the heroic path of developing an individual capable of bearing the burden of existence. It elevates parenting from a biological duty to a profound moral responsibility.
But practically speaking, how does a parent thread that needle? If the goal is to not let your children do things that make you dislike them, there is a risk that a highly irritable or impatient parent might just crush a child's spirit for acting like a normal kid.
Peterson acknowledges that risk, though perhaps not as thoroughly as his critics would like. He explicitly states that parents need to know what sort of monster they are. If a parent is unconscious of their own capacity for tyranny, anger, or resentment, they can easily become abusive. The rule requires intense self-awareness. You have to differentiate between a child who is genuinely pushing boundaries in a toxic way, engaging in a hierarchical challenge that breeds resentment, and a child who's just tired, hungry, or exploring their environment. The discipline must be aimed at fostering traits that make the child socially viable, like being good company or taking care of their belongings, not just making the parent's life quieter.
So the metric for dislike isn't just a parent's fleeting annoyance. It is a projection of societal standards. If a behavior makes the parent actively resent the child's presence, the parent must intervene because society will eventually punish that exact same behavior, but without the underlying cushion of parental love.
Precisely. The world does not care about your child's self-esteem. If a child is poorly behaved, adults won't teach them things, and other children won't play with them. Peterson is essentially saying that it is a parent's duty to be the proxy for the real world. By absorbing the child's frustration and correcting the behavior early, the parent acts as a shield against the much harsher, colder rejection that society dishes out to unsocialized adults.
That reframes the entire concept of a parent's job. It is not about keeping the child perpetually happy. It is about molding an adult that others can respect and who can respect themselves. When viewed through that lens, setting a firm boundary, saying no, and standing by it truly is the ultimate act of parental love.
It is a heavy burden, but as Peterson argues throughout his work, embracing that burden is where we find meaning. Taking responsibility for a child's character development is difficult, but avoiding it only guarantees suffering for both the child and everyone they encounter later in life. It forces us to look past the immediate discomfort of a crying child and focus on the adult they are destined to become. If you found this breakdown of Rule 5 valuable, text this episode to a fellow parent or a friend who appreciates deep dives into human psychology.